Oops. I forgot about the game. I'm gonna skip the intro since I don't have a lot of time. Hello, YouTube, hello Twitch. Hello, people that don't exist. Maybe you're here, maybe you're there. Maybe you just don't care. Or maybe you do care. And that's awesome. I like when people care about others. Especially if it's me. I need a better method of talking. Let me move my mic a bit. Okay. A little better, I think. I don't know. Do I need music? Maybe. I need the sound on. Should I watch something? I don't know what to watch. Something from the 90s? I'm also eating macaroni and cheese. Let me check my watch later real quick. Did I want to listen to something or watch something? Ew. This is interesting. Let's see what this is.
There is very little in any form of media that can compare to the sheer cultural dominance of the superhero. Ever since their origins as colourful tales of right and wrong, costumed heroes with extraordinary powers have become an ever-present part of pop culture, taking on near mythological status as they continually shift to suit our changing tastes and creep into every possible form of entertainment. What started life as serialized comic books sold from lowly newspaper stands has morphed into a multi-billion-dollar industry, an environment where the Avengers can become the highest-grossing movie of all time. The Joker can deliver 2 Oscar award-winning performances, and everyone from McDonald's to Audi are fighting to strike deals with the likes of Marvel and DC. In the world of video games, this preeminence is no different. And as the industry has grown from humble 2D into sprawling HD, superheroes have always been there. A willing partner for developers and publishers keen to capitalize on their towering popularity. Despite these cynical motivations, the results can often be incredible. And thanks to some visionary teams, characters like Spider-Man and Batman have become genuine video game icons, setting new standards for open-world design and cinematic action-adventure, all while selling millions upon millions of copies. But if the rewards are huge, so too are the risks. For every Marvel vs. Capcom and Hulk Ultimate Destruction, there is a Superman 64 or Batman Dark Tomorrow. And as live services degrade ambition even further, some very famous characters have been caught up in some very bad games. So with that in mind, we arrive at today's retrospective, the most chaotic collection of adaptations in video game history, derived from the most chaotic franchise in Marvel's arsenal, the astonishing, unlimited, uncanny X-Men. It might be hard to think of Professor Xavier's legendary team of mutants as anything other than a roaring commercial success, but in reality, their history is quite complex. For every heroic comic book or cartoon victory, there have been a surprising amount of cinematic defeats. And in a world dominated by Marvel's modern titans, this has often made them feel less than they once were. Now in 2024, the team have come roaring back into relevancy, thanks to a string of high-profile success stories. The shock return of the 90s cartoon in the critically acclaimed X-Men 97, the conclusion of Jonathan Hickman's generation-defining Krakoan Age comic reboot, and of course, the release of Deadpool and Wolverine, which broke box office records and became the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time. The X-Men are currently as hot as they have ever been, so it's all the more perplexing that it's been over a decade since their last video game incarnation. And as the industry has long since eclipsed comics and television and cinema in terms of commercial potential, this world of adamantium claws, optic blasts, and psionic energy seems conspicuously untapped. Well, in this video we're going to unpick the mystery and explore the fractured history of Marvel's mutant video games. Like the complex cast that calls Xavier's Mansion their home, this is a strange family indeed, as everything from genre-defining masterpieces to underappreciated cult classics to cash-grab licensing nightmares have all worn the X-Men name, and it's only by appreciating them together that we can hope to understand what might come next. Can there be cohabitation between the planet's largest media form and its most famous team of superheroes? Or are they doomed to a war that will forever leave both sides weaker? This is X-Men, a lengthy retrospective. Let's hope we survive the experience. So as is now tradition, a few brief notes before we begin. Firstly, I want to quickly address the long wait for this video and the slow pace of uploads this year. If you've seen my Onimusha video, you'll know that I've been undergoing cancer treatment for some time now, and as of the release of this video, I've just finished my second set of surgeries. There's no way this video could have been made or the channel kept alive without the support of my patrons, so I want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your generosity and faith in me. I hope this video goes some way to repaying that. Secondly, I want to establish what exactly will be covered in this video, because there's quite a big difference between X-Men video games and video games that feature the X-Men. The point of this retrospective is to explore the complex relationship between Marvel's mutant franchise and their video game adaptations, which means I won't be covering any games where they only feature as part of a wider cast or make a small cameo. I'll still be touching on big character crossover games like Marvel vs. Capcom or Marvel Ultimate Alliance, but it'll be within the context of titles that focus entirely on the X-Men or X-Men characters. On top of this, I've also got to make it clear that this video
My
is
robot
not an
vacuums
attempt
in here,
to
making
map
sure it
out
doesn't-
almost 6 decades worth of complex comic book lore, and will stick primarily to the stories and characters that feature in the games. This also means that I'm going to assume some basic knowledge on the part of the viewer, and outside of setting some context, I'm not going to explain the backstory of every single X-Man or the twists and turns of every comic book saga. Now that being said, you don't need to know anything to enjoy this strange journey, and knowing the difference between Cypher and Cyclops, or Miss Marvel and Marvel Girl, won't actually make that much difference. Finally, I won't be covering any mobile, browser or flash games, as I don't think they meaningfully contribute to the wider story, and would just detract from the flow of the video. Also, a quick thanks to Opera GX for sponsoring today's video and helping me keep the lights on while I've been unwell. You might have seen that Opera is on a mission to get people to break up their boring browsers. Thanks to an ad campaign fronted by Eric Andre, they're clearly pretty serious about it. Now my ad guidance wants to focus on its more flashy features, like its built-in GX mod store, which lets you add custom themes that bring everything from unique keyboard sounds to animated wallpapers, or the fact that Opera GX now has integrated AI tools, which you can use to summarize articles or quickly answer questions. That makes sense as it's all pretty eye-catching stuff, but unsurprisingly it's the simple things that I think make the browser stand out. It's got a built-in resource manager, so you can limit how much RAM it's using, which is particularly useful while editing and rendering videos. It's got a built-in ad blocker and VPN, which is great for those more private moments of browsing. And to top it all off, it's got a built-in pop-out video player, which lets you watch YouTube videos while you're working, or without the need for a second screen. As it's completely free and will import all of your bookmarks and cookies from Google Chrome, it's well worth a look if you want to try out something different. The download link is in the description below, and thanks once again to Opera. So with that out of the way, let's assemble this motley crew of genetic misfits and dive into the chaotic world of X-Men license games. The in-world origins of the X-Men are a story that is shrouded in mystery. Depending on the decade or the writer or the medium, we've gotten all sorts of explanations for the emergence of Homo Superior. In some stories it's ancient alien experimentation, and in others it's the natural process of human evolution. considering that the origin story is a fundamental part of almost every superhero's design, it's pretty strange that the X-Men don't have an iconic spider-bite moment, or parents tragically lost in a darkened alley. This is because when they were first created, all the way back in 1963, the whole point was to try and make a different kind of superhero team. You see, at the time, Marvel Comics were having unbelievable success with series like The Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and The Incredible Hulk. And so in order to keep up with demand, chief editor and lead writer Stan Lee decided to add a new series, one that would bring a fresh dimension to the company's roster. Rather than gamma-radiated scientists or cosmically blessed astronauts, he devised a group that was simply born different. Cyclops, Iceman, Beast, Angel, and Marvel Girl, a gang of outcast teenagers taken in by Professor Xavier, a powerful paraplegic telepath who acted as their leader and mentor. Originally, Lee had wanted to call the series The Mutants, but after this was vetoed by his publisher, they settled on X-Men, an allusion not only to Xavier's name, but to the extraordinary abilities caused by their unique genetics. Amazingly, even from the very first comic, Uncanny X-Men had a very distinct identity. And while most issues involved the team heading out to fight various monsters and villains, there was a lot more depth than you'd expect from a typical 1960s comic. There was a big focus on personal growth, dealing with prejudice, on coming to terms with being different and living in a hostile world. And most importantly, thanks to the inspired creation of Magneto, all these subjects were dealt with from both a heroic and villainous perspective. For a comic that was conceived in a single afternoon, it was all very impressive stuff. But unfortunately, American audiences weren't quite as enamoured, and the series struggled to find a consistent audience. After just 66 issues, Marvel stopped printing new stories and began to rerun older entries, which of course only further hurt circulation and led to its cancellation in 1970. Despite the creative concept and clear potential, the mixture hadn't been quite right, and the X-Men fell into the shadows of Marvel's big hitters, having failed to make much of an impact. So let's jump forward 5 years to 1975. Marvel's continued success had prompted a takeover by a large American corporation called Cadence Industries, which meant instead of Stan Lee's creative whims, the company was now driven by a need to produce constant growth and shareholder value. The fastest way to do this was to expand into new markets, and so Marvel writers Len Wein and Chris Claremont were tasked with creating a new superhero team that could appeal to non-American readers. Fortunately for Marvel, Wein and Claremont had long been looking for a reason to resurrect the X-Men, and so along with artist Dave Cockrum, the three produced Giant-Sized X-Men, a double-length special that ditched the old teenage team and rebooted the series with an entirely new international cast and a much more serious tone. Now starring iconic characters from all around the world, like the Canadian Wolverine, Russian Colossus, German Nightcrawler and Kenyan Storm, Giant-Sized X-Men was originally intended to be a quarterly publication, but it was so popular that Marvel immediately transformed the series into an ongoing monthly release. Claremont and Cockrum were let loose, and the results were incredible. The team went into outer space, went forwards in time, crossed over with every Marvel character under the sun, and even permanently lost friends in shocking stories that broke away from the cycle of safety that most heroes were locked into. By the mid-1980s, Uncanny X-Men had become the most important series in Marvel's catalogue, and was outselling every other comic to such an enormous degree that it often wasn't even included in magazine sales reports, simply because it was a given that the mutants would be the top seller. Now this perfect storm of success makes it all the more surprising that Marvel were relatively uninterested in leveraging that popularity outside of comic books, action figures and trading cards. As the world of cinema and television increasingly became the dominant forces in pop culture, and video game consoles had begun to creep out of Japan and spread across the world, Marvel appeared happy to license out their characters with very little interest in the quality of the product, or what this could do for their own bottom line. This hands-off approach resulted in the first ever Marvel licensed video game, 1982's Spider-Man for the Atari 2600, which was produced by a single developer, Laura Nikolic, who worked for the toy manufacturer Parker Brothers. You see, Parker Brothers were having a lot of success on the Atari producing Star Wars games, and looking to repeat this, they approached Marvel about using the legendary web-slinger. The deal was struck, and Nikolic was given 6 months to produce a game. But for some reason, Marvel didn't have a single piece of feedback during development, and seemed content to take the licensing money with no other involvement. Spider-Man actually ended up being quite a big hit, and even got a TV advert to help boost sales,
Oh,
but this
sweet.
lack of interest meant Marvel never pushed for a sequel. And when the American console market crashed in 1983, so too did any desire for further console adaptations. In fact, it would take until 1989 for another company to approach them with a potential deal. A publisher that specialised in licensed movie and sports games and wanted to make the jump into the world of comic books. The infamous LJN. Now, LJN have become synonymous with terrible licensed games, mainly thanks to the angry video game
Well, where are they
who's built an
thinking?
entire career off of the sheer madness contained within their releases. But before we dive into their X-Men title, I want to take a moment to explore just why they produced so many poor products. You see, originally LJN were a toy company, and throughout the 70s and early 80s, they'd been largely known for producing all manner of action figures
I was
and
not
striking
aware of
deals
that.
with anyone that would hand over their creation. This saw them work on everything from Gremlins to Indiana Jones to Michael Jackson and the WWF. They'd actually had a lot of success doing this, and in 1985 they were purchased by MCA for $30 million. Now MCA wanted to push this model even further and move into the growing home console market, so LJN began contracting smaller developers to create video games on their behalf, and overnight became one of the first American console publishers. Amazingly, they managed to sign deals with some pretty talented studios like Rareware and Atlas, who produced Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. But the problem was that
those
LJN treated
games.
these products less like movies and more like toys. So studios were given virtually no development time and even smaller budgets. Obviously this produced some very shoddy games.
CJs.
The margins were such that this was actually profitable, and meant that LJN managed to ship a whopping 27 NES games between 1987 and 1994. So, given that Marvel was more than happy to lend their properties out to anyone that would return a quick buck, it should be no surprise that LJN ended up with
Why
the
can't
comic
they
giant's Golden Goose. And similarly, no surprise that the result was a truly terrible video game. Unlike with Rareware and Atlas, the developer of Uncanny X-Men is something of a mystery, as the game begins without a splash screen, and the box, manual and advertising materials are only marked with the LJN and Nintendo logos. Strangely, the Wikipedia page lists both BothTech and Pixel as possible developers, but this is without any source, so it's hard to know why they're listed, which means we're heading in blind. Now that being said, despite LJN working with lots of different studios, their games all carry a
Hashtag on
similar
YouTube.
vibe, and Uncanny X-Men is the perfect example of this. A concept that sounds interesting on paper, looks captivating on store shelves, but is completely and utterly lacking quality. Let's start with the premise, which is found in the
Oh,
instruction
god
manual,
damn.
as the game loads straight into the level select and doesn't have a single screen of text to establish what's going on. According to Nightcrawler, Magneto and the Brotherhood of Mutants are on a rampage, and it's up to the X-Men to stop them by battling through 5 unique levels: Future City, the Underground, the Robo Factory, the Living Starship, and Magneto's Fortress, which is unlocked once you've conquered the first 4. The idea is that you pick 2 X-Men from a cast of Cyclops, Wolverine, Storm,
Island
Colossus, Nightcrawler and Iceman, and then head into one of the maze-like levels where you fight against endlessly respawning enemies while trying to hunt down the boss. Even by NES standards, it's a very straightforward structure, with no score system or hidden secrets, and instead all the complexity comes from who you choose to play as. You see, each of the characters has unique abilities and distinct stats, the idea being that you can mix and match your team as per the demands of the levels or your personal playstyle. For example, Nightcrawler can teleport through walls, which makes it a lot easier to get around levels, while Colossus moves very slowly but has a ton of health. Similarly, while Wolverine does a lot of damage, he can only
I thought that
attack
said
in mid
Snapchat
range,
for a
which is a
second.
big disadvantage
I
compared
use
to Storm,
Snapchat.
Cyclops and Iceman, who can battle from distance.
Alright.
It's a system that sounds interesting,
Nice.
especially in the context
Oh,
of the
shit.
game's 2 players,
Don't do that.
which encourages you and a friend to pick complementary heroes. But the problem is that this fun is extremely theoretical, and in reality, Uncanny X-Men is kind of a mess.
Wait, do
For
I have enough
starters, the
mana?
levels themselves have virtually nothing to do with the X-Men. Rather than adapting classic locations like the Savage Lands or the Shi'ar Empire or even Xavier's school, we get random jumbles of tiles that hardly even look like a cohesive environment, and enemies like skeletons, tanks, and spiders that really could be from any 8-bit video game. The only time we get to see anything that remotely looks like something from the comics is in the game's end-level fights, where we take on Boomerang, Juggernaut, Sabretooth, and the White Queen. but these
Shit,
moments
did they
highlight
get some?
another issue. Simply put, the game controls dreadfully, with extremely stiff
Did you forget I have word?
hit detection that would try the
GG's.
patience of a saint. When you're playing the melee characters, this is particularly bad, as there isn't even a distinct animation to indicate that you're attacking. And instead,
Hey, I'll be
you
right
get
back.
bumps in the direction.
My husband is calling. I'm gonna put on commercials. Be right back.
NBC!
High above the jungle, swinging from trees. I am Coco with my Coco Krispies. If I'm not careful, I end up in a bind with some big ape trying to take what's mine. But I'm too clever, I'm much too quick. I can make anyone fall for my tricks, oh yeah. Kellogg's Cocoa Krispies are such a chocolatey and delicious part of this complete breakfast. Even the milk turns chocolate with every bite so chocolatey. Oh, everybody wants my Cocoa Krispies.
Watch me trick Fred out of his Cocoa Pebbles.
What happened, Coco? What's wrong?
I can't keep fighting crime unless I get something super chocolatey.
You need my delicious Cocoa Pebble.
Truly super chocolatey.
Barney, my pebble.
Guess it's time to bolt.
Post Cocoa Pebble cereal, part of this nutritious breakfast.
This is the story of two houses. 4 years ago, the Taylor house was painted. In the same year, the Baker house had beautiful vinyl siding from Sears installed. Today, the Taylor house is peeling and cracking again. But the Baker house, with vinyl siding from Sears, looks as good as the day it was installed.
If you want to enhance the beauty of your entire home, or if you have a brick home with just hard-to-paint eaves and overhangs, do it right with maintenance-free vinyl siding from Sears.
And do it now, because you can save $500 and make no payments until March 1992 if you act now.
So if you want your home to look fresh and new year after year and enjoy big savings, don't pick up a paintbrush, pick up a phone and call for your free estimate now.
Call 1-800-492-8300 now for your free in-home estimate on Sears installed siding. Save $500 and make no payments until March of 1992. Call 1-800-492-8300.
We made a film for Nickelodeon. And we taught our hands to act. Lights, camera, action.
Alright, I'm back. Oh man. I had no idea what I was watching.
Direction you're facing, which makes it
I thought there'd be more
impossible
kids
to tell
commercial,
if
more
you've
cool
actually
commercials.
selected your hit. Now, even if you're using the
Kids
same
commercials, I
character
guess.
and know exactly where to go in
From
each
when I
level,
was,
it still feels like a chore to play, as the levels are full of instant
a young
traps,
otter.
dead ends, power-ups that freeze
Now
you
I'm
in
a
place,
ancient
and a
old
brutal lack of
bitch.
invincibility frames, which means it's very easy to become caught between two enemies and immediately
Right.
die.
Let's listen
You might
to
be thinking, well, with two players, surely all that won't matter.
Awesome.
I'm sure, played with a buddy, all this terrible design
Video.
can make for a pretty funny experience, but there is a knock-on effect to the single player. You see, when playing alone, you still have to take a second character, who you can switch to by pressing the select button. Although there's really no reason to do this, as the characters don't have situational powers or any distinct ways to interact with the levels. Unfortunately, the problem goes further than a lack of interest.
I can't believe,
in design, as the
I
companion's
won
AI
this.
is completely broken, and while they're alive, they'll wander in random directions, attack nothing but thin air, and prevent the screen from scrolling forwards. In fact, it's usually better to just let them die, which of course removes all the sense of a team adventure, something that's fundamental to the very identity of Marvel's X-Men. The cherry on top of the whole horrible pie is that the fifth mission, Magneto's Fortress, is hidden behind a set of requirements so absurd that I genuinely think the developer must have hidden it in embarrassment. When you beat each of the initial 4 levels, you'll see a text screen congratulating you on your efforts, but then nothing happens. What you're supposed to do is notice a unique enemy in each of the levels and then kill them 30 times before you defeat the boss. By doing this, the text screen will then highlight certain units in red, which when all put together spell out the last mission can be reached from the mission screen by pushing select and seek the advice of the label to make it to the final mission. Somehow, you're meant to realise that on the label of the physical game cartridge, hidden in the copyright information is a tiny code, plus B plus up together with star, which when combined with the instructions in the hidden message forms a code that takes you to the final level. Considering that there isn't a single hint in the instruction booklet or at any point in the game, I have no idea how anyone would ever think to follow this process. why the developer would want to hide away a fifth of the entire game. The only thing we know for sure is that thanks to Marvel's disinterest in the market and LJN's sheer lack of ambition and quality control, the X-Men's adventure in the growing world of home consoles had gotten off to a very shaky start indeed. Fortunately for our heroes, the video game industry in the 1980s was a varied and wild place. While Marvel were almost entirely disinterested in carving out a niche in the arcades or on the NES, they actually put a lot of effort into the world of home computers. Driven almost entirely by passionate grassroots developers like Richard Garriott and Sid Meier, this market had developed a very different identity to its console and arcade siblings, and as the complexity increased, so too did the sales, with games like Ultima and King's Quest becoming big international hits. Marvel wanted a piece of this action, and in 1983 they approached Adventure International with a deal that would see them produce Marvel licensed computer games for the next 10 years. Considering that this was Marvel's first ever long-term licensing agreement, they clearly had a huge amount of faith in Adventure International, and this was largely because the company's development wing was led by Scott Adams, an ambitious and talented coder who also happened to be a huge comic book fan. His grand idea was a series of games called Quest Probe, which would blend his text-driven adventure game style with various Marvel heroes, starting with the Hulk in 1984, before moving on to Spider-Man the following year, and then the Human Torch and Captain America. Now interestingly, Marvel gave Adams far more support than would later be given to LJN, as they sent not only one of their best writers, John Byrne, to help with Quest Probe's plot, but also produced a tie-in comic book, which would be sold alongside the games and really helped to make them feel like a serious part of the Marvel universe. It was a surprisingly forward-thinking approach to franchise building, but unfortunately Quest Probe was a massive flop. Despite Adams' reputation, the games were heavily criticised for outdated visuals and gameplay, and thanks to packaging issues, the comic was only available in very limited locations, all of which contributed to disappointing sales numbers. By 1986, just as Adams was beginning to develop an entry focused on the X-Men, the Quest Probe series was cancelled, and Adventure International filed for bankruptcy, which left Marvel without a presence in a market that was only continuing to boom. So let's fast forward 3 years to 1989, where Marvel went for another roll of the home computer dice. Although this time the situation was a little different. After being purchased by Cadence Industries in the 70s, the corporation was in the process of being carved up, and by the end of the decade, Marvel's comic book and animation departments were owned by entirely separate companies. Now the video game licensing ended up with an organisation called New World Industries, but as they had lots of financial issues, the deals they struck were rarely very good, and this is what had resulted in LJN getting hold of the license for console development. The situation wasn't much better on PC, as New World partnered with Paragon Software, an American developer that had only existed for 3 years and hadn't produced a single noteworthy game. Something about Master Ninja, Shadow Warrior of Death, and Guardians of Infinity to Save Kennedy must have given the impression of a studio that could make a major leap in quality. And so the rights were handed over, and Paragon began working on some of the biggest characters in pop culture. Obviously the X-Men were right at the top of the list, but it was actually Spider-Man and Captain America that hit shelves first, as in early 1989, Paragon published The Amazing Spider-Man and Captain America in Doctor Doom's Revenge for most personal computer systems. It was not received well, namely because when you removed the lengthy load times, the actual game was only around 20 minutes long and hardly featured any interesting gameplay whatsoever. This did not bode well for their next release, which would come just a few months later.
GG's.
Madness in Murder World. Firstly, it needs to be noted that, just like with Quest Probe 5 years earlier, Madness in Murder World was packaged with a tie-in comic book, and while it's some distance short of the quality of Claremont's Uncanny X-Men, it's a nice touch and makes the game feel like a cohesive part of the franchise. The idea is pretty simple. While the X-Men are away fighting a team of Sentinels, Magneto, the Juggernaut and the Blob attack the mansion and kidnap Xavier, taunting the team that they will never rescue their mentor thanks to an alliance with the supervillain Arcade. Now, Arcade is a bit of an odd character, as he's a hitman who kills people by imprisoning them in a mobile carnival populated with lethal traps and murderous robots, a comical modus operandi that means he's typically not all that threatening. Clearly he was chosen so Paragon could set the game in one of his murder worlds. But just like with LJN on the NES, we're once again left wondering why the developer didn't opt for any classic X-Men settings, rather than a world of clowns, snakes and living mummies. Regardless, Madness in Murdworld actually does quite a good job of adapting the franchise into 1980s PC form, and has some interesting ideas that impressed both critics and players. At first glance, this is just a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but very quickly things get quite a lot more complex. You see, the game is structured more like an old-school adventure game. They explore a large, sprawling map and have to find specific items in order to solve puzzles. And while there is quite a lot of side-scrolling combat, most of the focus is on navigation and correctly utilising your team's powers. Down at the bottom of the screen are a set of commands, basic adventure game verbs like pick up, put down, use and attack, but one of them allows you to change the X-Men that you're controlling. This is the crux of the entire game, as certain powers are required to pass certain obstacles, like Colossus being able to smash through doors, Nightcrawler being able to teleport behind fences, and Storm blowing away obscuring mists. On top of this, different team members bring different combat styles, and while Wolverine has a lot of health, he has to get up close and personal, while Dazzler and Cyclops can fight from distance. You have to utilise all of these characteristics in order to make your way through Arcade's Murder World, and in combination with more traditional game concepts like finding and combining items or hitting switches to open specific doors, there's quite a lot to keep track of and quite a lot of game for your money. Now this brings me on to the first issue, as Madness in Murdworld is a ridiculously massive game, to the degree that it actually detracts from the overall experience. The game's world is formed out of a staggering 500 unique screens, all of which contain various obstacles, enemies, puzzles, and all of which could be the area you're supposed to be heading to. As there is no in-game map and nothing provided in the manual, navigating around the murder world with any sort of purpose is virtually impossible, and it means that 99% of the experience is just wandering around trying to work out where you're meant to be going. Now sadly, this was probably done on purpose, as along with the instruction booklet, the box also came with an advert for a physical map that you could send off for. Considering that the game is virtually unplayable without it, it comes across as a deeply cynical move, and compares really poorly to the kind of immersive world design that was already becoming popular in games like Zelda and Metroid. Unfortunately, this isn't the only place where Madness in Murderworld comes up short. Combat is brutally simple, and really boils down to nothing more than hammering the attack button and choosing between a ranged or melee expert. Now there's nothing intrinsically
GG's.
but there are some serious issues, like weak visual feedback, poor hit detection, and the absurd decision to make recovering health impossible. To balance this out, we can save at any time, but as you need to have every X-Man alive in order to finish the game, it forces you into this absurd cycle of non-stop save scumming in order to make it through every single screen, which of course takes out any of the skill and slows down an already glacially paced game. Simply put, while the idea of switching between the X-Men and giving their powers unique applications in a large world is all well and good, it's just not executed to a high enough level, and compared with other PC games of the era, it's a largely tedious experience that fails to reward all your effort. Nowhere is this better exemplified than in the game's closing moments. If you somehow manage to assemble the Demagnetizer and defeat Magneto with every member of your team alive, the game tells you that you're victorious and then cuts over to a still image of what looks like the gang beating up Nightcrawler. Now I'm sure this wasn't the developer's intention, but it looks absolutely hilarious and perfectly sums up the game. Madness in Murderworld might look like the X-Men on the surface, but things are clearly not quite right. And once again, fans were left waiting for a game that would do the series justice. Now, despite my criticisms, somehow the game actually reviewed quite well. While we have no developer or publisher testimony, we know that Marvel were happy with the product, as just 12 months later, Paragon Software got another bite of the superpowered cherry. So despite a wonky start, Paragon stuck with the Marvel license, and as they continued to release games, the quality did start to improve.
I
In
like this
1990,
card.
they released The Punisher for MS-DOS, a game that interpreted Frank Castle's quest for vengeance as a sort of open-world bounty hunter sim, complete with randomly generated missions, first-person driving, and lots of top-down shooting. It's an interesting combination of ideas, but unlike in Madness in Murderworld, they aren't held back by a lack of polish, and the game sold and reviewed well. The same was true of The Amazing Spider-Man, which released later that year and took the wall-crawling and web-swinging of Peter Parker and transformed it into a sprawling, abstract puzzle game. It might sound like a weird way to adapt Spider-Man, but it seemed that Paragon had decided that source material accuracy wasn't all that important, and it led to a pretty great game by late 80s standards. So by the time we reached their second attempt at an X-Men game, there was every reason to believe that they might actually produce something quite good, and see the series reach its full video game potential. Well, X-Men 2 Fall of the Mutants isn't quite that, but it is a very unique game, and proved that Paragon were at least becoming a studio with a bit of developmental ambition. Right off the bat, things are quite different to Madness in Murderworld, as rather than telling an entirely new story with a supplementary comic book, Fall of the Mutants is a straight adaptation. In 1990, Marvel had published an X-Men specific crossover event called, surprise surprise, Fall of the Mutants, with the idea being that as humans pushed for the Mutant Registration Act, 3 different X teams would all be drawn into separate but thematically linked adventures. This game is specifically an adaptation of the Uncanny X-Men section, which sees an ethereal monster known as the Adversary capturing Storm and Forge and triggering a globe-trotting rescue mission. A plot that you might recognise from X-Men 97, as it was also adapted for the 2024 cartoon reboot. Now, while the comic uses this to explore the relationship between Storm and Forge, the video game doesn't feature any of this, and instead, just like they did with The Punisher and Spider-Man, Paragon are simply using Fall of the Mutants as set dressing for their gameplay. So after we see the Watcher appear on screen and ask, what if a different team fought the Adversary? That's it. We're thrust into the game, and there's no more narrative until the very end, which shows Storm and Forge breaking free of their captor and the team enjoying their victory. It's a bit of a shame, especially considering that Fall of Mutants is quite a good little story, but I think this was Paragon playing to their strengths, which clearly lay in game design rather than writing. Now at first glance, it might seem absurd to even call Fall of Mutants a sequel, as it looks absolutely nothing like Madness in Murderworld. We now choose a team of 5 from a whopping 15 different X-Men, with a larger roster now including popular characters like Psylocke, Havoc, Kitty Pryde, Phoenix and Rogue, a welcome decision that replicates the sprawling cast of X-Men's 3 comic book series. Once you've done that, it's straight into the mission, to track down 2 members of the evil Brotherhood of Mutants, who will open the path to the Adversary when defeated. The only hitch is that we don't know exactly where they are, so the Watcher gives us a choice of 3 randomly generated levels, and then it's up to us to use our team to track them down. Obviously the visuals are another major departure, as everything now takes place on grid-based maps, which are viewed from a top-down perspective and are quite reminiscent of classic PC RPGs or dungeon crawlers. In fact, it feels like Paragon has taken a lot of influence from those genres, as concepts like party composition, battle formations, and managing your resources now play a much bigger role. This is because our adventure is now on a timer, and as we explore the levels, time passes between night and day, which hampers our vision and thus our exploration. Whenever we head into a new zone, we're given 3 weeks to discover the evil mutants, but this is balanced against the need to camp, which advances time, but is the only way to restore your mutant powers. Just like in Madness in Murderworld, these are used to get past X-Men specific obstacles, like Rogue flying over rivers or Kitty phasing through walls, and this is also what allows you to do powerful attacks in combat. This means that the game is in a constant tug of war between spending your power to make further progress, but then having to camp, which uses up time. Now when it comes to combat, this is where Fall of Mutants feels most like Madness in Murderworld, but also least like it. And that's because it actually has 2 different combat systems. For some reason, Paragon have given us the option to deal with opponents either in a turn-based, semi-automatic system, or in a side-scrolling beat-em-up where we take direct control. It's a very weird choice, and frankly I see absolutely no reason why you'd ever choose the turn-based mode, which really has no depth to it other than choosing your formation and waiting to see how much damage you've taken. In side-scrolling mode, it's a little bit more involved, and it's here you get to dive into the differing hero mechanics, flying around in the air as Archangel, blasting foes from distance with Longshot, or tanking huge amounts of damage with Wolverine. Again, it's not particularly complex, but each character does feel distinct, and approaching combat with a team that has Colossus, Beast and Cyclops feels very different to one where you rely on Phoenix, Havoc and Iceman. Now, while all this probably sounds pretty good, there's still a pretty heavy dose of Paragon software jank, and I'd say that Fall of Mutants still lacks the polish that the best PC games of the early 1990s were starting to show. There's virtually no music in the game, and only about 3 different sound effects: footsteps, distorted hitting sound, and one male scream, which is used whenever any enemy dies, regardless of if they're even human. Similarly, the choice of enemies outside of the Brotherhood of Mutants is pretty weird, and gives the whole experience a decidedly non-X-Men atmosphere. We fight hordes of giant dinosaurs, put down legions of barbarians, and even do battle with the Viet Cong. A situation that's inspired by revelations about Forge's past that makes very little sense without any of that context. The reality is that, just like with The Punisher and Amazing Spider-Man, Paragon were focused on creating interesting gameplay systems above being true to the source material. And while Fall of Mutants is a similarly strange take on the X-Men, it's at the very least a unique experience that showed that the studio had come a long way from the horrors of Master Ninja or To Save Kennedy. Funnily enough, this burgeoning reputation didn't go unnoticed, and in 1991 they were purchased by Microprose, the legendary PC publisher and developer that was run by Sid Meier. Given the change in leadership, Marvel decided against continuing the PC licensing agreement. But this was far from the end for Paragon, as they would go on to develop Challenge of the Five Realms and BloodNet, both of which are now considered cult classic MS-DOS games and are still available to buy today. Challenge of the Five Realms in particular shares a lot of design DNA with Fall of Mutants. And while it's much more complex and ambitious and visually cohesive, you can definitely see seeds of its ideas in the X-Men's dungeon-crawling mission to defeat the adversary. So, despite Paragon software finally coming good, the X-Men were once again left high and dry. But importantly, Marvel were beginning to recognise the benefits of teaming up with talented development studios. As the decade rolled over into the 90s, these relationships would start to become more important than ever. At this point, I think it's appropriate that we head off on a little side quest and talk about the most famous mutant of them all. Funnily enough, Wolverine didn't begin life as a mutant, originally appearing as an opponent for the Incredible Hulk, and then later being reworked into the Canadian mutant secret agent that won him a spot in the 1975 giant-sized X-Men reboot. Even his iconic costume was a bit of a fortunate mistake, as artist Gil Kane hadn't properly followed Len Wein's instructions, and rather than drawing him cat-like with claws coming out of his fingertips, Kane designed a pointed costume with adamantium blades jarring out from between his knuckles. It was a striking look, and his role as the voice of chaos and violence within the group made him a popular figure, but he didn't really come into his own until 1982. When writer Chris Claremont was asked to produce a Wolverine solo miniseries. Not wanting to simply push out a bog-standard, action-focused spin-off, Claremont instead teamed up with acclaimed writer and comic book genius Frank Miller, and the two set out to give Logan more depth and a reason for all that pent-up anger. The outcome was Wolverine, a 6-issue miniseries that reimagined the X-Men wildcard as a tortured soul, desperate to get away from his vicious instincts. Rather than a loose cannon, he's portrayed as a Japanese Ronin, a lost warrior without a cause, and the series ends with him finding love and getting married. Now, despite the surprising narrative and challenging themes, Wolverine was a smash hit and catapulted the hero into the comic book limelight, quickly leading to a wildly popular ongoing solo series and a level of pop culture notoriety that's only matched by giants like Spider-Man, Superman, Batman. Given he was such a recognisable character, it was an inevitability that LJN would try to squeeze more juice out of their console license with a standalone Wolverine game. Unsurprisingly, it enjoys a similar reputation to its uncanny cousin. It's often described as another low-quality LJN cash grab. But my friends, the story behind this strange little game is rather more interesting than you might initially think. You see, once again, LJN were only publishing, and instead of simply shipping the game out to the cheapest option, they went to a specialist, a video game studio run by the visionary developer and businessman Richard Kay. Kay had been a passionate independent PC developer in the early 80s, and after seeing how much potential the industry held, he formed his own company, Software Creations, which developed home computer games out of his in-law's spare bedroom. Very quickly, business began to boom, and thanks to some accomplished Commodore 64 ports, the team soon had their own office and were striking deals with some of the biggest publishers in the world. Now, this would have been enough for most people, but Kay had bigger ambitions, and after seeing a Famicom during a publishing meeting, he managed to win a contract with Nintendo after his team reverse-engineered the machine and programmed effects that even Shigeru Miyamoto thought were impossible. Under this new partnership, the team created Solstice, a completely unique title that used an isometric perspective and blended RPG-style storytelling with creative puzzle design, and ended up being a critical and commercial success. This brought Software Creations to the attention of big international publishers, one of which was LJN, who quickly signed a deal to have the British company produce their Marvel licensed console games. Now, the first of these you probably already know, Silver Surfer for the NES, an 8-bit shooter that has been rather unfairly remembered as a terrible game, thanks to the influence of the angry video game nerd, who tore it to shreds in one of his first ever videos. In reality, the game is a pretty creative take on the shoot-'em-up genre, blending top-down and side-scrolling perspectives, an open-ended, Mega Man-like structure, and one of the best soundtracks in early console history, a masterclass in 8-bit composition by the legendary Tim Follins. While it certainly is very difficult, it's no more so than something like Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins or Konami's Gradius. And I think it's a shame that it's been lumped in with the worst of the NES, as along with Solstice, it showed that Software Creations was a team with a lot of talent. So this brings us on to their next title, 1991's Wolverine for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Like most NES games, the motivation for our adventure is found in the instruction booklet, where we have a big double-page piece of art that depicts Wolverine waking up on a desert island. The only sign of life is a monstrous fortress that looms over the beach. And so without a better option, our hero heads towards its gates and the game begins. Very quickly, it becomes apparent that this is a situation that's been orchestrated by Wolverine's animalistic nemesis, Sabretooth, and the game is structured as a set of 9 trials, which all begin with a taunt from our villain. Now, this is quite a weird premise, and doesn't really fit the dynamic between these two characters, which tended to revolve around brutal physical conflict, and Sabretooth pushing Wolverine to the edge of his powers. So, while it might not be a good fit for the license, the structure does at the very least work from a video game perspective, and it means we get 9 distinct action platformer levels, each with their own unique mechanics that aim to test Wolverine's skills in the field. Now, just like with Silver Surfer, Wolverine also enjoys a pretty negative reputation, but this time, many of those complaints ring pretty true, and it's clear that this sort of game wasn't really Software Creations' forte. At its core, Wolverine is a basic action platformer. You leap between platforms with the A button and punch and kick with the B button. It's a formula so simple that you can hardly believe anyone could get it wrong. But in their pursuit of attempting to be more inventive, Software Creations have ended up making some pretty brutal mistakes. The first is that while jumping is tight and responsive, Wolverine's attack animation feels far too short, and it forces you to get very close to enemies in order to connect your hits. Most other NES action platformers either have you jumping on enemies to kill them, or revolve around ranged attacks. And I think this is a great example of melee combat.
Sorry, I was muted for a minute.
In side-scrolling 8-bit form. Now, you'll have probably noticed that Wolverine isn't attacking with his claws, and that's because to use them, you have to press the select button, which draws them out. This gives you a little more range and a stronger attack, but for some reason it comes at the cost of your life, which means you're discouraged from using them at all. Perplexing choice, considering that's half of the appeal of even playing as Wolverine. Along with the decision to have Wolverine heal by collecting burgers, rather than using his built-in healing factor, it certainly feels like a confused adaptation of the character. Rather than rushing into the jaws of Sabretooth's traps, you end up having to play very cautiously, carefully positioning to the enemies, and generally avoiding combat as much as possible. Not really what you think of when you imagine a Wolverine solo adventure. Now, while this makes for an odd X-Men experience, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with these mechanics, but any hope of sustained enjoyment is regularly spoilt by the ridiculous lack of invincibility frames. You see, unlike in classic platformers like Super Mario, Castlevania, and when Wolverine takes damage, he does not get invincibility. And this means just a slight mistake in your positioning or movement can drain away huge amounts of health, even killing you in seconds if you land in a particularly bad spot. This one system makes the game very punishing and forces you to play so slowly, learning every inch of every level so that you can grab all of the hamburgers and avoid losing your progress in the blink of an eye. To be fair, Software Creations have attempted to balance this with generous checkpoints and a very strange system that utilises a few mutant allies. In level 2, you can find a hidden door near the bottom of the stage, and inside, Wolverine discovers Psylocke, who gives him a transmitter that you can use to call in Havoc for an assist, likely a reference to the short-lived Wolverine and Havoc series that Marvel published in 1988. If your health falls into the red zone, you can press select, and this calls in our mutant friend, who will destroy all of the surrounding enemies and heal you while he's on screen. What makes this interesting is that not only does Havoc recharge in between levels, but the duration which he can be used for increases if you make it to the end without calling him. This gives the game a whole new dimension. Do you risk pushing on with low health in order to save up a bigger heal, or use Havoc frequently but with less effect? It's an interesting idea, and this makes it all the more baffling that it's not only totally optional, but very easy to miss. It's not even the only time this happens. There are randomly hidden warp zones that can skip out entire levels, and another secret room where Jubilee gives Wolverine some breathing apparatus that doubles the amount of time you can spend underwater. These sort of mechanics help give the game a sprinkling of X-Men flavour, but unfortunately they don't really make up for the lack of iframes and the horrific attack animation, which dwarf any of the good intentions that Software Creations might have had. In keeping with its odd take on the license, Wolverine resolves with back-to-back boss fights against Magneto and Sabretooth, although here the Master of Magnetism takes on the role of henchman, and Victor Creed is dispatched by repeatedly bashing him until he falls off of a cliff. Sadly, our only reward is a picture of Logan looking pretty peeved at the whole situation. No explanation for how Sabretooth managed to build this fortress, or what Jubilee, Havoc and Psylocke were even doing there. Now, while it's hard to exactly gauge the financial success of Wolverine, as we don't really have many contemporary reviews to reference or any information about how well it's sold, it must have met publisher expectations as Software Creations continue to work with LJN. The following year they were put to work on the Terminator license, which resulted in yet another rock-hard action platformer, and then in 1993 they channeled this love of difficulty into Treasure Master, a game produced for MTV that rewarded skilled players with a code that could be redeemed for real-life prizes. Software Creations might have come a long way when producing Commodore boards in Richard Kay's bedroom, but fan expectations were quickly rising, and thanks to a juggernaut of Eastern development, they were about to hit levels that would be very hard for any studio to follow.
Your soul burns with might.
In the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was one video game company that dominated the licensed game space like no other. A titan of Japanese development, the mighty Konami. These days, they're better known for holding Silent Hill, Castlevania and Metal Gear Solid hostage, but back in the 2D era, they had a reputation for extremely high-quality arcade games like Frogger, Gradius and Contra. Now, while other companies were busy trying to create unique characters and iconic mascots, Konami took a different approach and put a heavy emphasis on securing already popular licenses, a strategy that saw them absolutely dominate the arcades at the turn of the decade. In 1989, as Turtle Mania was sweeping the world, they put out Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a highly acclaimed 4-player beat-em-up campaign that led to enormous manufacturing demand and absolutely raked in money for any establishment that could get hold of one. They followed this up in 1990 with Aliens, an extremely popular adaptation of the James Cameron blockbuster, and which was only outsold by the continued popularity of TMNT, which itself got a sequel called Turtles in Time in 1991 and continued the hot streak. As if this wasn't enough, Konami then struck a deal with Fox and applied their beloved multiplayer beat-em-up formula to The Simpsons, which not only received rave reviews for its gameplay, but coincided with the show's wildly successful second season and turned the game into yet another arcade phenomenon. It was clear that not only did Konami's developers have a golden touch when it came to memorable visuals and creative gameplay, but whoever was striking the licensing deals really knew what they were doing. So it should be no surprise that in 1992 they got their hands on the #1 superhero series on the planet, Marvel's X-Men. Now interestingly, you might think this deal was born from the imperious commercial success of the X-Men comic series, but that is only partially true. In 1991, Chris Claremont's long run as the series writer came to an end, and Marvel used this opportunity to conduct a bit of a soft reboot, splitting the characters into 2 teams and launching an all-new premiere series that was simply titled X-Men. Buoyed by the popularity of single-issue comics and a monstrous collector market, the first issue of X-Men sold a ridiculous 8
they have anything
million
with
copies,
Johnny?
which made it the best-selling comic of all time, a record which still stands today, and nothing has ever come close to breaking. The X-Men were about as popular as it was physically possible for comic book characters to become. But surprisingly, the deal with Konami had its origins in a very different art form. Here we have to turn to Margaret Loesch, a television executive who was singularly obsessed with the multimedia potential of Marvel's mutant freedom fighters. In the late 80s, she'd been the chief executive officer of Marvel Productions, and while it was a pretty successful company, mainly thanks to the popularity of the Transformers and My Little Pony, Loesch felt they were missing a trick by not adapting more of Marvel's comic book heroes. In particular, she felt the X-Men's diverse...
I'll be right back. I'll go to a Caramarson.
We Little Miss! Mine wants to be a ballerina! Now what's your change? Eyeshadow, lipstick too, ribbons on each ballet shoe. Magical! Beautiful! Ooh, wow! My wee Little Miss is a sleepyhead. She's awake now! Wow! Ooh, wow, wee Little Miss! Wee Little Miss dolls change with warm and icy water. You can collect them all, each sold separately, new from Mattel. I want to be on NBC. I want to be on NBC.
And you'll be with Bo Jackson, Wayne Gretzky, and Michael Jordan, the Pro Stars.
Low nose cartoon.
I want to be on NBC. Be with movie superstar Macaulay Culkin as Wish Kid. Yogi Bear and his all-new Yo Yogi cartoons. And the coolest cats in a litter box from beyond. Saturday mornings this fall. If you want to be with the best cartoons, just say, I want to be on NBC.
NBC.
High above the jungle, swinging from trees. I am Coco with my Coco Krispies. If I'm not careful, I end up in a bind with some big ape trying to take what's mine. But I'm too clever, I'm much too quick. I can make anyone fall for my tricks, oh yeah. Kellogg's Cocoa Krispies are such a chocolatey and delicious part of this complete breakfast. Even the milk turns chocolate. With every bite so chocolatey. Oh, everybody wants my Cocoa Krispies.
Watch me trick Fred out of his Cocoa Pebbles.
Captain Coco, what's wrong?
I can't keep fighting crime unless I get something super chocolatey.
You need my delicious Cocoa Pebbles.
Truly super chocolatey.
Barney, my pebbles.
Guess it's time to bolt.
Post Cocoa Pebble cereal, part of this nutritious breakfast.
This is the story of 2 houses. 4 years ago, the Taylor house was painted. In the same year, the Baker house had beautiful vinyl siding from Sears installed. Today, the Taylor house is peeling and cracking again. But the Baker house, with vinyl siding from Sears, looks as good as the day it was installed.
If you want to enhance the beauty of your entire home, or if you have a brick home with just hard-to-paint eaves and overhangs, do it right with maintenance-free vinyl siding from Sears.
And do it now, because you can save $500 and make no payments until March 1992 if you act now.
So if you want your home to look fresh and new year after year and enjoy big savings, don't pick up a paintbrush, pick up a phone and call for your free estimate now.
Call 1-800-492-8300 now for your free in-home estimate on Sears installed siding. Save $500 and make no payments until March of 1992. Call 1-800-492-8300.
Amazingly, the rest of Marvel Productions' executive team did not agree and wouldn't give the go-ahead.
Anyway, I'm back.
Show. The only available option was to move around existing funds, and so an episode
got Silver
of
Tier
Robocop,
3.
the animated series, was cancelled. And the money used to produce an X-Men pilot,
No, that show
which
cancelled.
Loesch hoped would whet network appetite. The product of this
I didn't watch it.
experiment was X-Men: Pride of the X-Men.
I hated how
an extremely
kitty
strange adaptation
Robocop
that
got.
took some major liberties with the source material and lost most of what made the series stand out.
I remember
For
watching it on
starters,
video.
The tone is wildly different to the comics, swapping out the
I don't
edge
even know
of
how we got
J.P.'s
it.
art and the tragedy of Chris Claremont's writing for something that is extremely child-friendly and focused on colourful good guys and
I
rather
felt that more.
unthreatening
There I go.
villains. It's potentially understandable considering the market they were going after, but what's less clear is the decision to change
Nina,
fan
what the
favourite
hell
Kitty
are you doing?
Pryde into a hysterical damsel in distress,
Licking your
and why Wolverine,
lips.
the most iconic X-Man of all, was reimagined as a wisecracking Australian, all of which meant the pilot didn't make much impact when it was test
Yeah,
aired
Wolverine was
in
Australian for some
1988.
reason.
Later that year, when Marvel Productions were purchased by New World, they immediately cancelled every TV show other than Muppet Babies. And then in 1990, Margaret Loesch left the company, and the X-Men TV experiment was put out to pasture. So, what does all this have to do with an arcade beat-em-up? Well, strangely, it was this TV pilot, rather than the comics, which Konami had secured the license for. Now, the theory is that this was done to get around LJN's stranglehold on the license, as Konami's game released 4 years after the Pride of the X-Men test pilot, which means it's not hard to imagine that this was done to get Japanese hands on the franchise, rather than to help advertise an upcoming show. So, in 1992, an arcade cabinet simply titled X-Men released worldwide, and was almost immediately a huge success. Contemporary reviews declared it one of the finest beat-em-ups ever created, and despite Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II absorbing virtually every quarter on the planet, X-Men ended up being one of the highest grossing cabinets of the year. Clearly Konami had struck gold again, but what exactly made this partnership so very potent? Well, from the looping intro screen, it's immediately obvious that this was a high quality adaptation. Before you've even put a coin in the machine, you're treated to really cinematic shots of the Brotherhood of Mutants and X-Men, all rendered in a level of detail that was leagues beyond the NES and Commodore games of the past. Now, you would expect an early 90s arcade cabinet to be much more advanced, but even by Konami's own high standards, X-Men is genuinely a gorgeous game. Backgrounds are highly detailed and often have pieces of unique animation. Foregrounds shift and break apart as you battle through levels, and everything is presented in a vibrant, multicoloured style that really draws from the golden age of comic books. This attention-grabbing look is also helped by an extremely high-energy soundtrack that perfectly complements all the action, and uses lots of weird sound effects to give the levels more character. Simply put, on almost every level, this is a game that demands to be played. Even in the darkest of arcades, its bright lights and bombastic sounds would have stood out for all the right reasons. Now, another thing that advanced arcade hardware enabled is a proper X-Men story. And while Konami have opted for something a little more straightforward than the tragic epics of Chris Claremont, this is the first time that we have an X-Men game that truly feels like it belongs in the franchise. The premise is simple. Magneto has taken control of the Earth Sentinels and turned them on their creators, which leaves our heroic X-Men as the last line of defense against a global apocalypse. Now, the story doesn't really get any more complicated than this, but the reason it works so well is that once again found in the presentation. We see little cutscenes that depict the Sentinel attack. We actually hear Professor X send the X-Men out on their mission, and as we fight through the Brotherhood, each one of them feels fully realised, with expressive sprites and even more voice lines. In fact, the amount of voice acting is genuinely pretty impressive, as every single character has lots of unique lines that play in either cutscenes or during boss fights, although it does have to be pointed out that many of them are hilariously mistranslated. Thanks to the game being developed in Japanese, we've been given classic lines like Magneto's "Welcome to Dawn" and the eternally funny "I kill you, X-Chickens." In any other game, this would be a huge flaw, but the lines are just so hilarious that it actually adds something to the experience and balances out all the edgy self-seriousness that 90s video games could often fall prey to. So it looks and sounds great, but the real success behind Konami's arcade beat-em-ups lay in their gameplay, which blended multiplayer action with pure accessibility. When you start a game, you're given a choice between 6 different X-Men: Cyclops, Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, and Dazzler, who are the team that starred in Pride of X-Men. Now, each of them plays almost exactly the same. You can attack with the middle button, jump with the left, and do a special move with the right. But the variety is found in all the different attack animations, and how faithfully they recreate the style of the individual characters. All of this is based on the mutant special moves, which let Cyclops fire out a powerful optic blast or Storm unleash a tornado, which wipes out the entire screen. But it's also more subtle than that. Sometimes when you do a jumping attack, Dazzler will do a little cartwheel, or you'll see Colossus grab an enemy and put them in a neck breaker instead of doing his regular attack. While they're all functionally the same move, it makes each character more distinct and fun to play as. Something that's made all the better by how satisfying the combat is. Special moves are really strong, the punches feel weighty and responsive, and really it's just clear that Konami
Because I
are
could just
masters of
keep
this genre
doing.
and
They've
knew
got
exactly
2 mana
what
too
they
much
were
fast,
doing.
so.
Unfortunately, this does bring me to one criticism, which is that while Konami had crafted a top-tier arcade,
I don't have much mana
the goal
either.
wasn't
I'm kind of
actually
mana
to
screwed
make
compared to
enjoyable
them, so
video
it's just
games,
gonna get
but rather rake in a lot
dumb.
of money.
But
As with all of their arcade
I gotta get
games,
going
the next
anyway.
bit
It's
is a
late.
tough
I didn't
top,
want
where you're
to
constantly
get on too
swarmed by
late, which I
enemies
did.
and don't really have many options
But
with which to avoid
this is a
taking
cool
them
video.
down.
I'm gonna watch it more
Counters
later.
against us
Oops.
during the boss.
Thank you for chilling. Thank you for hanging. Bye 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 bye. I'll stream more later. Love you lots. So. Bye. Bye.